am recording. This event is brought to you in partnership by the Colorado Department of Ed, the Colorado Department of Higher Ed, and Fort Lewis College, and you'll learn more about that partnership in the consortium in a bit. Also have some sponsorship by Educational Testing Services for our speakers this week. This convening is actually something that started last year. Around this time in November, we were meeting with ed prep leaders around the state to discuss the best practices report, which was statutorily required in Senator Todd's Bill 19190, around the best practices in educator preparation, to which prep providers were supposed to respond with their self-assessment of how well that is being implemented in your colleges and universities, and a 3-year plan for implementation of your top goals. And one of the practices that came up as being an identified need was this Principle 2 and Practice D specifically, that teacher preparation programs include a focus on family engagement strategies. That need became incredibly apparent then once we hit COVID. In the spring, a couple of different needs assessments were conducted, one by the Colorado Education Initiative and Colorado Department of Education administered a survey. They received 370 responses from 91% of our school districts and BOCES across the state, in which family engagement was identified as a need in all 8 regions of the state. The top needs, of course, were student emotional support, tech issues for delivering remote learning, online instruction support for teachers during remote learning, and again, family engagement. But family engagement specifically and student emotional support came up as the top 2 in all 8 regions of the state. Early Milestones Colorado did a similar needs assessment survey to the early childhood workforce. They received 6,000 responses from over 1,200 early child care providers, both in-home providers, education centers, and school districts. And 63% of those teachers and caregivers identified keeping family engaged as a top need that they needed as well. So it really solidified the need to make sure that we're infusing this appropriately in preparation, and so the need for our inclusion of it as a topic, specifically around culturally responsive education and the intersection of the two. So I would like to introduce you to my friend and colleague, Darcy Hutchins from the Colorado Department of Ed.
Thank you, Britt, and good morning, everyone. And I see some familiar names in here and some new friends. So we're so glad that you could join us. Before I turn the time over to another colleague, I just want to go through very briefly the evolution of family, school, and community partnerships, so FSCP, at the Colorado Department of Education. And this is really boiling it down to the bare bones. So one of the big milestones was in 2009 with the formation of the State Advisory Council for Parent Involvement in Education, which was Senate Bill 0990. And this Senate bill created a P20 council for stakeholders from across the state to give feedback to CDE and CDHE, the Department of Human Services, as well as schools and districts, about what best and promising practices should be for family, school, and community partnerships. So after SACPA was created, fast forward 4 years, and with Senate Bill 13193, that created my role, my position at the Department of Education as, at the time, Family Partnership Director. Colorado is the only state in the country that has a legislated director level position at a state department to support partnerships. The same year in 2013, Nevada also passed similar legislation creating a position, but it's more at a specialist level and not at the director level, which is helpful to have some teeth and some legislation behind it. Another unique piece of that legislation in 2013, it said that all 178 school districts in the state needed to appoint a contact to this director, so to me, so that the department could have this systemic support structure and communication channel with the districts who can then share information to schools on how to best partner with families. In 2019, the position of Family Partnership Director then became an Office of Family, School, and Community Partnerships. And SACPI, the Advisory Council, was reauthorized to include 2 more parents. So we now have 1 parent per congressional district in Colorado. From 2018 to 2020, the Colorado Department of Education then developed a preschool through 12th grade framework to make sure that schools and districts had the tools and the research necessary in order to sustain and bring to scale comprehensive partnership programs that link to student achievement. There's going to be more on that in the next slide and throughout this whole week. And then the reason that we're all here today is because, oh, and I'm seeing a typo there, I apologize. So from 2020 and then ending next year in 2021, Colorado is one of 7 states in the country to take part in this pre-service consortium, the purpose of which is to inform at a national level what should be included in a micro-credential for family school community partnership in prep programs. So both teacher prep and administrator prep. This is just a quick slide to show how the Colorado Department of Education, based on 2 years worth of stakeholder feedback, defines family, school, and community partnerships, and then the 4 essential elements. And this is just a teaser to say, if you want to learn more, first of all, stay on this webinar because Dr. Sanders will be talking about it a little bit, but I'm going to be going into much more detail about this framework and its accompanying resources on Thursday morning. So if you haven't registered for that yet and you're interested, there's still time. And then here's some of the many available resources to support family, school, and community partnerships at the Colorado Department of Education. We will be sharing these slides with everyone after the session, and each one of these images is hyperlinked to where you can locate them on the CDE website. And again, I'm going to be going into much more detail about how these resources can support you and your teacher prep programs, as well as new teachers and in-service teachers. And with that, I would like to turn the time over to my colleague and friend, Dr. Kristine Greer. Chris is the Associate Provost at Fort Lewis College in Durango, and she's also one of the founding members of SACPI, of the State Advisory Council for Parent Involvement in Education. So Chris, take it away.
Thank you. So we are really excited to be part of the consortium, the national consortium, and we've learned so much from other states. We'd like to duplicate that in Colorado, and so we'd like to work together with all of you and other colleges that may not be here right now to develop a pre-service framework for culturally responsive family engagement and higher education curricula. And we would love to hear recommendations for coursework, mentoring, supervision, field experiences, and have that be a contribution to state policy. We're going to be modeling the National Association of Family, School, and Community Engagement Pre-Service Consortium. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we propose a place for teacher education preparation educators to talk about their successes and learnings and institute best practices. That's what we're hoping to do this week. Darcy gave a little thing for her, so I'm going to say tomorrow we are going to have a student panel from Fort Lewis College talk about their experiences with culturally responsive pedagogy and family community engagement. So what we'd like to do is have a consistent time and place. We'd probably use Zoom for a while, maybe monthly, maybe quarterly, and develop a place where we could share materials and syllabi, as well as contemplate new ideas and solve problems together. Also with SACPI, we've been wanting to do this for a really long time, but we haven't had a place or an opportunity that we could really get people together. So this will be wonderful if you'd be part of it. So if you are interested in this, please put your name in the chat and let us know if you would like to be part of this. Thanks.
And so now it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Mavis Sanders. Mavis and I go way back to the early 2000s when she was my advisor at Johns Hopkins University. She's now a professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, UMBC, and she runs the Sherman Center for Early Learning. Mavis also focuses a lot of her work on school community partnership. She has several books that have been published and has been writing articles and books and conducting research about family school community partnerships for over 20 years now, for a couple of decades, moving on to a few decades. So with that, I am going to give Mavis control of my screen. All right, Mavis, so click anywhere on there and take it away when you're ready. And you're muted.
Okay, there, I believe that I now have the screen and you can hear me. Is that right?
Correct.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining this morning. I know it's Monday morning. I know it's early. So for those of you who have been able to come and share this time with us, that's fantastic. And I really look forward to the next hour, an hour or so, to talk about family school community partnerships and what educator preparation programs can do to facilitate and advance this work. As Darcy said, I've been working on this for a couple of decades, and I have been able to observe various actors around the country and how they're thinking about defining and implementing family school and community partnerships. So given that oftentimes there are different definitions of family school and community partnerships in folks' minds, I think we can start off by trying to establish a common one by pulling on the Colorado State Office of Family School and Community Partnerships definition. And there are a couple of things that I really want to draw your attention to right now that Darcy made reference to earlier, but that is the fact that the definition begins with families. And so Colorado, taking the lead in this respect, is saying that we're centering families in our understanding of family school and community partnerships. You'll see that they also talk about early childhood as well as schools. So this is really a pre-K through 12 initiative. And so we want all educators, principals, administrators, teachers from early childhood all the way through secondary to have the capacity to develop, implement, as well as evaluate. So some of our candidates will be going into schools with well-established programs. Others of our candidates will be going into schools where they may have to initiate some of these practices. But at the end of the day, the focus is on improving educational outcomes for all children. And so this definition gives us a roadmap about how we can think about family, school, and community partnerships. And I really want you to think about, as we go through these slides, how are partnerships defined in your educator preparation programs, and how are they defined for your candidates? So we begin with this definition, and then we want to move on to understanding why after all of these years, I've been engaged in this work for nearly 3 decades now. And I would say since the 80s, this latest focus on family engagement has been occurring since the 80s. But then we have different historical periods where there has been a focus on either family engagement, family school community partnerships, community engagement. Why do we come back to this topic so much in education? Why is it one that sort of continues to rotate in and out of the national dialogue? And I think the reason we come back to it is because the theories as well as the empirical research that support family, school, and community partnerships is so strong, right? So we have any number of theories that we can draw on, but I wanted to point out the work of Brothenbrenner, for example. And Brothenbrenner's work is important because he highlights the fact that children's learning and development occurs in these embedded contexts. And at the sort of micro level, the center of these embedded contexts, the sort of foundation of these embedded contexts, if you will, are just the family, the school, and the community. And the meso level focuses us on the interactions between them. So it's not just the family that affects learning and development, not just community-based organizations, not just schools, but it's really the relationships between them that have some impact on how effective they are independently for the children that we share as a society. Joyce Epstein, who both Darcy and I have had the opportunity to work with over the last 20 years or so, she highlights what are the factors that influence how well those different institutions work together. So how well families will work with schools, how well schools will work with community agencies has a lot to do with the philosophy by which they approach their work, their attitudes, their past experiences, their practices. And it's important to note in that theory that these things are malleable, right? They're malleable over time for different students. And so education preparation programs have something that they can contribute to the work of family, school, and community partnerships based on that theory. I also want to highlight the fact that Epstein has come up with 6 types of involvement. And those types are basically parenting, communicating, volunteering, learning at home, decision-making, and collaborating with the community that shows us the broad ways in which families and communities and schools can interact with one another to support students' learning. So we have both that theory and the 6 types of involvement that she's contributed. And then lastly, Comer focuses our attention on the fact that when we talk about child development, when we talk about learning, we're talking about a very broad notion of learning and development that includes different pathways. And those pathways are the cognitive, the psychological, the ethical, the social, the physical, the linguistic or language. And the reason we know that these pathways are so important is simply because one institution alone cannot address all of these developmental and learning pathways alone. It really does take that village approach. And so bringing families, bringing communities, bringing schools together is the one way that we can ensure that children develop along all of these pathways. And so these are just some of the theories that underlie the work of family, school, community partnerships. But if it was just theory alone, I don't think we would have the same level of staying power. The reason that we have come back to families and communities and schools so often is because we not only have the theory that undergirds this work, but the research also supports it. Now, if I wanted to identify all of the people who have contributed to this research knowledge that we have, the sort of empirical database that we have, it would be too time consuming. But luckily, we have some key people who have conducted reviews or meta-analyses of all the research that's been done over the last few decades. And they write about this in a pretty consistent way. And I want to draw your attention to the work over the last, let's say, decade or so. Ann Henderson and Karen Mapp have The New Wave of Evidence, which is a review of over 50 studies on family engagement, family school community partnerships, and its impact on student outcomes. That was published in 2002. Nancy Hill is another name that you'll hear a lot in the field, along with Diana Tyson. They have a review on family engagement or parent involvement. You know, our language evolves and changes, but we're basically talking about the role of these caring adults in children's families, schools, and communities. But they have a meta-analysis out on what are some of the effects of family engagement on middle school learners' outcomes. William James, I'm sure you've heard a lot about him in this field. He has conducted several meta-analyses. He also has a book that was published in 2010, but that book, along with meta-analyses conducted in 2003, 2005, you see the years there. He has been able to compile anywhere between 50 and 70 studies just to see what are the average effects for children on a variety of outcomes when you have the families and communities and schools working together. We have also moved into what do teacher educator programs need to know and do and provide to their students. So there's also reviews and compendiums done around that topic, as well as what are the effects of teacher training on teachers' engagement practices. And then I direct you to Susan Sheridan and Tyler Smith on those. So there's a body of research that's really compelling, really important. And basically what it tells us or shows us is that the research findings show a consistent and significant influence on students' academic achievement, behavior, attendance, homework completion, graduation rates, and attitudes not only towards school, but also their ability to do well in school, their self-concepts. All of these are outcome variables that are positively associated with family, school, and community engagement and partnerships. It's important to note that these findings are consistent, especially when the family engagement and the partnerships are proactive, not reactive. So this presupposes that families and communities and schools are working together before there are problems, not in reaction to problems. We also know that family engagement interventions make a difference, that certain families are going to be engaged because they feel comfortable doing so. But for other families, that's not going to happen unless there is some outreach. So these family engagement interventions that are co-developed between families and educators and administrators make a difference. And lastly, the research that is emerging around teacher training programs and EPPs, educator preparation programs, is that they make a difference. That when they focus and support families, educators in doing this family outreach work, educators have a stronger sense of their ability to do this work, that they feel as though this work is a part of their professional responsibility, and they engage to a greater extent. And so with the theory and with the research, we know that this is really important, but yet, even after decades, we find that there are barriers and if not actual bars between families and educators, sometimes it feels that way, right? So whether they are symbolic bars or, closed doors, there are barriers to family engagement and school, family and community partnerships that we have to address. Otherwise, we know that children will not be able to achieve and be as successful as we all are sort of focused on ensuring. So, how can we move beyond these bars? And what are some of the bars or the challenges that prevent effective partnerships? We can think about those on both the family side as well as the school side. So what do we know about families? From research, as well as some of the theories that have been proposed in the field, parental role construction can play a major role in whether or not families are going to be involved or how they're going to be engaged and involved in their children's learning and development. So for some families, they feel as though it is the family's role to make sure that the child has food and shelter and clothing, and that when we talk about learning and education and those things, that is the responsibility of the schools. So they have a clear delineation that says, it is not my responsibility to be that first and continuing teacher for my child. Some families also may be less inclined to be involved or engaged actively in these partnerships because they lack a sense of efficacy. They may not feel as though they have the capacity to really serve in the role of supporting their children's learning. And if there's not support in doing that sense that they cannot make a difference or they don't have the skill set to make a difference can prevent them from doing so. And lastly, families differ in terms of size, in terms of the level of support. We know that we have single parent families. We know that we have dual income families. And so there are demands placed on families depending on the number of children, depending on other dependents that are looking to them, drawing on their resources, drawing on their energy. And so different demands on time and energy can create challenges to partnerships that have to be addressed. And we not only have these challenges for families, we also have challenges for schools. Schools are cultural institutions. They move, they operate under certain codes, using certain language. There are certain norms that are established within the school. And if you have families who don't understand those norms or whose background are different and they have a different language or different practices, there can be this cultural mismatch that can be a challenge to effective family, school, and community partnerships. Also, misconceptions of families. This can happen based just on stereotypes that we're all exposed to, or sometimes misconceptions can occur even within a community. You know, I've gone to so many schools and people have said, in this community, in our community, families don't really, they're not really available. They don't really care about education. Just very broad generalizations that can prevent us from seeing opportunities for partnerships. And so those misconceptions of families can also be barriers or challenges to effective family, school, and community partnerships. We talked a little bit about the fact that the research shows when educators have professional development, they feel more confident in their ability to develop these effective programs of partnership. But without that professional development, without resources at the school site, they can feel as though this is piling on and just one additional thing that they have to be focused on and they have to do in addition to all the other things that they're being held accountable for. And that might lead to one of the last challenges, which is lack of outreach, because outreach does take time. It takes time, it takes planning, it takes resources, and that's drawing from other things that teachers may feel are held in greater regard by the principal, by the school leadership, or even by the families themselves. So when we think about creating effective partnerships, we have to think about not only the fact that we know this is what is best for young people. But we have to also understand that there are challenges to partnerships that have to be addressed in order for us to achieve the objectives of effective family, school, and community partnership programs. And so that leads us to this notion of what becomes our guideposts. How can we begin to think about both best practices, the research, the theory, as well as overcoming the challenges so that we can move forward in this particular area? And of course, national standards always help. The National PTA had a set of standards that were modified in 2009, and those are the standards that we currently operate under. These are the national standards for full service, for family, schools, and community partnerships. And they begin with welcoming all families, right? So we know that if there's a context where we feel welcome, then we're more likely to participate, we're more likely to show up, we're more likely to show up with a positive attitude that says we can make a difference. So a welcoming climate for all families is a starting place. But once we get families in, we have to sort of keep them engaged. Once educators have created these welcoming spaces, there's work to be done to sort of maintain the partnership, because what we're talking about is maintaining relationships. And we know that all positive, effective relationships are supported by effective communication. So what does that mean? It means at the end of the day that we are sharing information that promotes understanding of among all stakeholders. And that's how we know it's effective. When people have heard us and we have heard them, and we have this shared understanding. Supporting student success is the third standard, and that success is across the board. So we're looking not only at academic success, which is very important. So we're looking at grades, we're looking at test scores, but we're also looking at their development broadly as we are directed to by COMER. You know, are children coming to school, do they feel good about themselves? Do they have a positive self-concept? Do they have the tools? Are they culturally competent as they go out into the world to engage with the world in a very productive way? Are they ready to be productive citizens? That is a sign of success as well. The fourth standard is talking about advocacy. Are we making sure that we are addressing the needs of all children and speaking up when we see inequity in our schools, or when we see that certain students may be invisible or their needs may be invisible? Are we ensuring that we're speaking up for every child? And that means sharing power. Are we setting a round table at our schools where everybody has a place and we can see each other and hear each other and respect each other, and how we sort of share the power around decision making and the kinds of decisions that we make on behalf of students, as well as their families and communities. And lastly, are we engaging with the community? So we're bringing community resources into the schools, and we are allowing the school resources to promote community development. Those are 6 standards that have been established by the National PTA, and that guides the work around family, school, and community partnerships for teacher education programs, for schools, for districts, for state departments of education. In Colorado, because Colorado is definitely a leader in this regard, there's one additional standard. So there are 7 standards that sort of guide the work in Colorado, and is one reason why we are assembled here today. You heard about SACPI early on, established in 2009. They have been continuing this work and expanding this work into teacher and educator preparation, right? So the professional development and pre-service training for administrators and teachers should include the building the capacity to do this work. So whether you're going through educator, administration programs, teacher programs, do you come out with the skills, the knowledge, and dispositions required to really advance the work of family, school, and community partnerships? So those are the standards that we've talked about. I have been talking for a while now, and my computer really likes to skip around. But I would like for you now to tell us what is going on in your programs as they relate to the national standards for family, school, and community partnerships. Specifically, are you familiar with these national standards? I'm going to ask that the poll be launched so that you can respond to that first question, the initial poll question. Are you familiar with the national standards? So if we can launch that poll.
So Mavis, give me just a second. We're competing for control of my computer. So I'm going to take control away from you for just a second.
Okay, go ahead. And you can keep control.
control.
I'm comfortable with you going through the slides, so feel free to keep control.
Okay, let me move back
Okay.
to that. I will pull up my video again. Interesting times when I'm like, no, I need it back. And then Mavis says,
yeah, I will.
Seeing wonky things happen.
Field control, there you go. So we are going to go ahead. If you can answer the first question, are you familiar with the national standards? And do you integrate the national standards in your teacher preparation programs? We have some responses coming in. We're about 25% now. So those of you who haven't yet voted, please go ahead and vote in the poll. Perfect. Thank you guys so much. We're at 60%. It's coming in. Let's give it maybe a minute more. I would love for us to get to at least 80% participation. So we're almost there. Perfect. It looks good. So what I'm seeing on the screen, and I think everybody can sort of see this with me, is that we only have about 13% who say that they are familiar with those national standards. Over 50% say they are not, and a third say somewhat. So we know that there's some work that has to be done because these national standards will be the foundation from which we build the more effective family, school, and community partnership programs. So that's really, I think, telling, and it shows the work that has to be done. When we talk about integrating those into the teacher preparation programs, again, for those who are more familiar with the national standards, is almost, you know, a reflection of those who are actually integrating those national standards into their EPPs, right? So we have about 13% who are familiar and about 13% who are integrating. Again, out of the people who are, because we have about 85% who are saying that they either are not familiar or only somewhat familiar. And then we have 50% who are saying to some degree, we're integrating them to some degree. And we'll see more about how they're going to do that, how they're doing that with later polls. And then we have folks who are saying that no, they are not integrating those in their teacher preparation and professional development programs. And that makes good sense because if you're not familiar with them, it's really hard to integrate them. Also, you have to figure out how best to integrate it. Which courses, if you don't have a set course, how do you integrate them? So these are great poll results. It would, for those 13%, so it's about 2 people out there who are currently familiar with them, and they're also integrating those national standards in their teacher preparation programs currently. I don't want to put anybody on the spot, Darcy, but it would be great if we could allow them to unmute for about a minute each, just talk about, or 2 minutes each max, to talk a little bit about how they're integrating those national standards into their teacher preparation programs, and also how they became familiar with them. So 2 different points.
All right, so for the 2 people who said yes, that you're familiar, and I'm fairly certain that one of those is my colleague, Dr. Gloria Miller at DU, if she answered the poll. So whoever those 2 were, if you're willing to unmute and share, we would appreciate that. We'll give you just a second.
I don't think it's fair because I probably was one of them.
Oh, and Gloria's here too.
So let's hear from Gloria.
I think that the efforts in Colorado and working concertively with CDE over the years has helped. Having colleagues at the State Department, I'm training school psychologists and special educators, so there are many ways that these principles need to be integrated all throughout. We were able to get a standalone course approved and is taken by most of our school psychology and school special educators. So those were things that you had to kind of bring to the forefront. I haven't had as much success because of the standards not being merged with some of the teacher ed standards that need to really be, I think, talking together with each other. So our teacher ed program is accredited by, I think, 3 different bodies, and none of the accreditation bodies really have substantially incorporated some of the national standards that we're talking about. And I find that is very much a barrier in working with my colleagues in the teacher ed department.
You know, I would agree with you, Gloria, and we actually have 2 courses now. We have one in our special education master's program, but we also have one in our elementary program, and that's an undergraduate program. That we've had that since 2006, and our family is just got approved last year, and we'll be doing that next spring. So I have the same concerns about all the alignment of the different accreditations that we have to do.
These are absolutely critical points, because oftentimes when we talk about the challenges, we do focus on the school level challenges. We don't talk about challenges at the policy level that actually seep down and also affect what's happening on the ground. But you're absolutely right. With the accreditation, once we can integrate this into the accreditation standards, I think we will see more movement, because it gives people permission to find space in the current course curriculum for teacher educators, and not only in special ed, where we know we can't move without partnerships, right? And in early childhood education, oftentimes you'll find it, maybe in elementary, rarely in secondary. But then we find in secondary, those educators struggle the most with family engagement because they haven't been given that kind of support. So you raise really important areas for SACPI, other PTO, PTA, SACPI, to begin to think about how can we move this to the accreditation level for our EPPs. I think that that is a very sort of important point. And without that, it's really going to take leadership by individuals like, you know, Kristine, like Gloria, who are actually saying, we know that this is important. We know that this is an equity issue. We know that this is an issue that is important for our educators to feel comfortable. It's a retention issue for keeping educators in schools. It is an issue around effectiveness and improvement. How can we come together within our programs and figure out ways that we can integrate this content? And we have leaders already. We have special education we can look to. We have elementary ed we can look to. We have special ed, we have counseling. How can we take the best practices there and more fully integrate it into our teacher or educator preparation programs as a unit? How can it become a part of our unit vision? That's really an important question, and I hope it's one that everyone who's currently online can sort of take back to their institutions once we sort of, once this week is over, this week of sharing and professional development is over.
Mavis, we also had, I don't want to mess up our timing here, but Kelly Woodrow mentioned that she's using the dual capacity building framework for family school partnerships. So I'm curious, Kelly, are you interested and willing to give us a very quick summary of what that looks like in practice?
Sure, we build up to it in the course. So it's in the 5th week of the course after we look at a lot of other equity issues. But we have students looking at MAPS material from the Department of Education and looking at that framework, taking it all apart. And then she offers case studies. So then we have them go back and apply that same framework to an analysis of the case studies and then talk about what their schools and classrooms might be able to do to approach some of those practices.
That's really great. I think case studies are such an effective way of building students' capacity, building that critical lens, that reflection that we know is so necessary for this work. So that is definitely a best practice that I think can be incorporated as we move forward. Thank you very much, Kelly. And the good thing is that this is being recorded. Also in the chat box, people have introduced themselves. So I hope there's an opportunity for people to continue to pick each other's brains and talk about best practices at various points along the week. Yeah, we're already getting people sharing kudos and important pats on the back and making connections. So thank you very much. As we proceed with this discussion, we know that we have these standards. We have to become more aware of the standards so that they can be the guideposts as we begin to prepare educators for this important work. But we have to also think about the standards within an equity framework. And in my engagement with students, sometimes equity is a hard issue to approach. People are very comfortable oftentimes with notions of equality or equal, like giving everyone the same thing. That sort of resonates with definitions of fairness that people are comfortable with. But we know in schools, because of various experiences and contexts and histories, that everyone isn't coming to us at an equal level. And so if we want to ensure that we have success for all students, if we go back to the definition of family school community partnerships, where all students have access to high level or high quality education, then we have to accommodate student differences, right? So equity really says if we want to make sure that every student gets a piece of that apple, has access to that apple, then we have to accommodate them based on how they come to us and their needs, right? So we know here with this figure that a child who is very tall, and we say, go grab an apple, and you have the equal chance of the child who is very short, we know that equal is not sufficient to give them equal access. And that's what equity points us to. Equity points us to thinking about what is necessary to ensure or give all students the opportunity for success. So when we go to the next slide and we start thinking about, we think about, well, how are these equity issues played out? And I'm pulling some data from Colorado to talk about, well, there are equity issues. There are differences that make a difference in students' access to a high quality education. So we know that there are equity issues, for example, in the teacher-principal student diversity gap. This is not only in Colorado, it's basically across the United States. You know, you would have maybe 47 out of 50 of the states that have a significant teacher-student principal diversity gap. What do I mean? Well, if you look at the students, the percentage of students based on ethnicity and or race, and the percentage of teachers in that same racial or ethnic category, you'll see that there's basically a gap, right? So in Colorado, for example, if we look at the Hispanic Latinx population, it's about a third of the student population in your public schools. But you only have 9% of teachers who identify as Hispanic or Latinx, and then 10% of principals. And you see this diversity gap across ethnic and racial groups. So white students make up maybe a little over 50% of the student population, but your teachers and administrators are well over 80% or 80% or more. Why does this matter? Well, there's a growing body of research that says two things. First, when students have same race, same ethnicity teachers, they actually have a higher chance of taking more rigorous academic courses. They have fewer behavioral problems, lower suspension rates, higher achievement. So there is an achievement or student outcome link between the ethnicity and race of the teacher and that of the student. There's also a body of research that talks about cultural competence for all students, and that when students have the opportunity to be taught or to engage with diverse teachers, diverse role models, diverse instructors, that they come out with different kinds of attitudes and a greater level of cultural competence. So that's one reason why looking at the teacher-principal diversity gap as an equity issue that needs to be addressed is important. If we go to the next slide, we'll see that these equity issues play out in different ways. I know this screen may be difficult for some of you to see, but the first slide focuses on NAEP results, only 4th grade reading results in Colorado. And I want to first acknowledge the fact that Colorado's test scores have increased for all students quite significantly since 1998. But we still see that there is a diversity gap in achievement, especially when we look at basic. So when we look at the basic outcomes for NAEP, that means that children and students, as you well know, have the requisite skills to access more challenging curriculum, right? When they're at proficient, that means that they've basically mastered the skills that have them on that college and career ready track. And of course, advanced means that they're sort of well above that. But when we look at, do the students have the requisite skills, the sort of basic skills to begin to build on and access more complex instruction, we find that while 82% and 72% respectively of white and Asian students have met that sort of basic benchmark in terms of reading by 4th grade, we only have about 58 and 54% of Black and Hispanic students respectively. And then of course with the American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian populations, they weren't large enough to get a sort of average score and percentage there. But we see that that gap, that equity gap, is visible in the achievement of students using these NAEP scores. And you'll see the same types of gaps for 4th grade math, 8th grade math, and so forth. These gaps don't close necessarily over time. And then when we look at graduation rates in Colorado, on-time graduation rates, you have an average of 82% of students who are graduating with a high school degree on time within that sort of 4-year period that's expected. You have a greater number of those in your Asian population, and then also in terms of your white students surpassing what that average would be. But if you look at your Hispanic and Black populations, you'll see that they are below the average. So again, we're seeing these equity gaps. And then among Asian students, even though we have the 90% who are at on-time graduation, it is unclear because that population might include students from a variety of socioeconomic backgrounds, immigrant statuses, and also countries of origin. So we know that Vietnamese, Laotian, Hmong students have a different trajectory than Korean, Japanese, and Chinese immigrant or ethnic populations. And so we see these diversity gaps that continue to, and equity gaps that continue to affect the outcomes of the students who graduate from our public schools. If we go to the next slide, this is when we think about family and community partnerships and when we think about collaboration, we know that these equity gaps have very sort of complex origins and they will have complex solutions. Schools are only one of the institutions that can contribute to reducing these equity gaps. And family and community engagement is just one of the strategies that schools can use to reduce these equity gaps. But all hands on deck is the way that we can effectively address them. So it's not a panacea. Schools alone are not a panacea. Family engagement practices alone are not a panacea. But if we think about these, if we think about family, school, and community partnerships as one of the strategies to help us address these equity gaps, then we begin to see a road forward. We begin to help our teachers and our principals understand that we all have something to contribute to improving educational outcomes for all students. So let's revisit the standards and what they mean from an equity lens, right? So standard 1, welcoming all families. When we think about that from an equity lens, that means what type of strategies are we considering? Getting to know families. We talked about earlier that one of the challenges was that we have these misconceptions of families. The only way that we can help move beyond that challenge is to really get to know families, inviting them into the building in a welcoming way, recognize and creating opportunities for different types of family involvement. We have talked about Epstein's types very briefly, but there are many different ways in which families can be involved. We even see that with the national standards, advocating for one's child, in sharing power on the PTO, PTA, coming to school events. All of these are different ways that families can support their children's learning. Teachers recognizing that and recognizing that it may not always be in the building, that working families may not be there, but they may still be supporting family engagement is really important. And then building those positive school climates so that everyone wants to come, feels welcome once they come to the school, and understands how they can contribute to the success of their children. I'm pulling these real life examples from my conversations with educators, parents, teachers who are really doing exemplary work in this area, right? So this is one parent who's talking about in real life what this looks like and what it looked like for her child and her family. And she says, at the first, there was an open house that I took my daughter to. It was nice. Her teacher tried to get to know us. She tried to get to know my daughter a little bit, just what I expected and hoped for. Welcoming and concerned. She likes her job. So I think honing in here, the fact that this parent was saying what I expected and hoped for. This is where families are saying they really hope to have educators and schools where their child is considered important and seen and visible, that the teacher seems to enjoy being there. They seem to be concerned about the child's growth and development and learning. This is where the hope of families lies. And I think for the educators who can create that space, they really are reducing the stress level and the anxiety level for so many families. And for families who see this, they are more likely to see possibilities of engagement and partnership. So oftentimes, just teachers creating that space and knowing how families respond to that space and how to create that space, if we can produce candidates like that, we have already sort of opened the door for family engagement in a way that might not have been open otherwise. So let's look at the next standard, the standard of communicating effectively. What does that mean? And how do teachers do that? Oftentimes in the early grades, in elementary and early childhood, a teacher may have a classroom of students and they have just that classroom of students. And so they may have anywhere between 20 and 30 students that they're responsible for over the course of the year, and they can build those relationships. For teachers in secondary schools, where they may see anywhere between 100 or more students over the course of a semester or an academic year, how can we give them the tools to communicate effectively? How can we talk to them about communicating regularly? Meaning, at the beginning of the year, before the beginning of the year, oftentimes teachers are out there sending positive postcards, sending text messages, making phone calls saying, I'm going to be your teacher in this particular area this year. I'm looking forward to seeing you. So we talk about communicating regularly, maintaining two-way communication so that families don't feel as though they're always being talked at, but there are opportunities for an exchange. Because we said effective communication is when one party understands the other party, that information has been shared and understanding has been facilitated. That's when we know communication has been effective. So there has to be an exchange. How can we help our candidates understand how do you create those things? And lastly, how do we make sure that they know how to access the interpreters, the translators who are necessary, and also how to move past the jargon and the acronyms that are so much a part of our profession. And yes, we may need those and they may need to be very aware of those. And we spend time making sure that they are aware of all of the acronyms and the various terminologies and stuff that we use within the field. But we also want to make sure that they're able to explain that to the layperson who is not in the field in a way that promotes their understanding, and it doesn't make them feel as though they are limited in their understanding about how to help their children. We want to make learning and children's learning and development and teaching and all of those things accessible to people. We don't want to hide behind language. So how do we build the capacity of our educators to do this? This is one high school teacher who was really a standout in her high school, where The other teachers that we were able to interview and observe talked about the importance of family engagement, but also the fact that families weren't interested in being engaged in that particular community, and that they found it very difficult, and that the families were facing so many challenges that they didn't have time to be engaged. But this is what one teacher shared. 95% of the students that I teach, I have their parents' phone numbers and I text them regularly. I'm texting their parents literally right there in the class, because if I don't, I may forget about it, or I'm calling the parents, updating them on their kids. I try to make sure that I have this balance of when your child is doing really well, I am texting, hey, just so you know, Cameron is on track and he's doing really great. Or just so you know, I'm concerned because so-and-so is falling behind. There is not a week that passes that I am not texting or calling parents, right? So this secondary teacher this high school teacher who has hundreds of students found a way to basically get those phone numbers early in the year, save them into her phone, and then for each class, while the student is engaged, she's saying, this is what I'm doing. While they're seated doing desk work, or if we have a prompt while they're writing and I'm seeing something, I'm communicating with families. And I make sure that it's not just negative information, that I'm sharing good things about their children, which makes folks much more open to partnering and effective collaboration. Let's go to the next slide with standard 3. I'm going to speed this up a little bit because I know you guys need a break. Supporting student success. What does that look like? In order for us to support all student success, some of the equity strategies that our candidates have to be aware of is this notion of self-reflection. You know, making sure that when I look at different outcomes in my classes, that I'm not contributing to those because of some maybe unconscious or implicit bias that I have. How can I be reflective about my practice? That's the reason the case studies that Kelly spoke about earlier is a great tool, because they promote that self-reflection. Look at this case. Let's discuss it. Let's think about it. Also, what do culturally community responsive practices look like? How do you build on families' funds of knowledge? What are family funds of knowledge? How do you build on community resources? How do you draw those into your classroom? How do you make families and communities feel as though they have something to contribute to student success? And then this notion of a critical lens. How can we begin to look at what is equitable, and whether or not we are creating school spaces that are equitable for all the populations? And this is what it might look like. This is a teacher who was at an elementary school, upper elementary grades, and she's like, I have had discussions with administration about this. I mean, my own stepchild is Hispanic, so I get that. But on the other side of it, I don't feel that there is enough, like, Black history is not taught. And I think it is really, really important, because you have these two marginalized groups competing for jobs in this city, and there is a lot of racial tension. And I think we do a really bad job of having that conversation. And so this is a teacher who was actually a white teacher who says, I'm looking at the school setting and I'm concerned that all of my students feel as though they have a place, and that we are aware that maybe we could make a difference in promoting cultural competence across the school populations. So whether students are Latinx or Black African American or Asian or white, that all of them understand that they have a space here in our school, and we're going to make sure that everybody has a space, and that they all appreciate the cultural resources and wealth that they're all bringing to the school. That's how we begin to support student success, and we have to build the capacity of our candidates to be able to do that. So let's go to the 4th standard. When we look at speaking up for every child from an equity lens, it is very much linked to supporting their success. Being able to make sure that not only Are we seeing and ensuring that everyone is at the table, that we're setting a round table, but that we're giving families the information about school policies, about programs, about scholarships, about processes, so that everybody has the information in order to advocate for every child, that we listen very closely to what families are saying about whether or not, the needs of their children are being met. All of this is so important. We talk about race and ethnicity, but we also have to talk about disability status. We also have to talk about language and immigration status. All of these are like really important when we talk about every child and the whole child, and that we encourage and support family advocacy. The teacher that we just sort of pulled from, who went to the administration, she was being an advocate. We also want families to feel comfortable being advocates. That takes a lot of courage. It takes a while for people to find their voice, and it also takes time for people to have the courage to use their voice. And sometimes that you have to have somebody to say, go ahead, do that, or I'm glad that you spoke up, or I really appreciated your comments at the other meeting. And so this is one parent who was talking about how a teacher, just by sharing information and encouraging her, helped her to be an advocate for her child. She said, I had to go off about it. And this is the parents, like, I had to go off. She didn't want to. But this is how I got into the after school program, because they didn't accept my son this year again for 3 years. This is the third time. And then when I talked to the teacher, she was like, you need to go talk to them, because it was a kid that just came to this school and they got into the program that they didn't put him in, her son. So I think it was a little favoritism, says the parent. But if it wasn't for the teacher to say, your child should be able to get in this after school program. And it was a big deal, because working families really needed the extra support by having to place their children in an after school program. But so she was able to get her child in the after school program. He was able to learn chess. He was able to get homework help. She was able to have extra time at work that she needed. So it was a real boon for that entire family. But if the teacher had not encouraged and given her the information, she wouldn't have been able to advocate. So letting our teachers know that your support for families, giving them information and support, is really important. And that's a way that you can build more equitable school outcomes. Let's go for standard 5 really quickly, sharing power. We all know that that's hard. We on the policy level, even, as in education preparation programs, we talk about setting that round table. It is not easy. But helping our candidates understand that, yes, as a teacher, you have power. Administrators have power. Families also have power. We have to figure out how to share and use that power in a goal-focused, oriented way that elevates all children, that supports all children, families, and communities. So we have to acknowledge families' expertise about their own lives. They have expertise about their own lives. So we want our candidates to be able to engage in them in a conversation that respects that expertise and knowledge. We also want to be able to respect diverse perspectives. That is a lost art. And I don't know if we are building that capacity among our educators the way we want. You don't have to agree with people to understand and respect their opinion and be able to find the common ground. Finding the common ground and listening and respecting diverse opinions is something that all of our educator candidates should come away with. If we can say that we've helped them do that, that is a disposition that NCATE and CAPE might want to also consider when we talk about knowledge, skills, and dispositions. That's an important disposition. And we need to be able to help them understand the role of PTAs, PTOs, PTSOs, SSTs, I believe that they use in Colorado. All of these teams are at the school level. Are our candidates aware of them, the role of them, the importance of them? Are they prepared to participate in these? And if necessary, start these kinds of collaborative structures and institutions to make sure that there is a mechanism for power sharing. This is one educator in a high school who says, you know, in our school family council, that's what they call it there, you have administration, you have teachers, you have the union rep, you have a police officer, because at these particular schools, there was a school officer. You have parents, you have students, you have community part. Everybody is at the table and they're sitting down and they're talking about, okay, what's going on? What do we need to focus on? But when I started, there were no parents coming in the school and there was no school family council meeting. There was no PTSO. So she really had to take the initiative and with the administration, start it and bring families in and let them know you have a role to play here. Let's go to standard 6 really quickly. Lastly, this collaborating with the community. Do our candidates understand what that looks like, how you can begin to define community, creating opportunities for students to contribute to community development, giving those community resources. We talked about the teacher, principal, student diversity gap. One way that we can offset that almost immediately is by bringing in community partners that sort of reflect the diversity of our schools and allowing them to become a part of the teaching, the learning, the development of our students. So one teacher, and this is at a middle school in a city, I'm not gonna tell you which city, well, said there was a group of us and we were always reaching out. We were looking for outside folks, partners, teams, just people or adults, even if they were our friends or business owners that we knew that may not have been in the community to help support whatever it is we're trying to do. There were folks that were wanting to be volunteers in the community. And through them, we were able to connect with other people, which was great. So slowly but surely, we were sort of getting in outside folks just to help the students with whatever it was at that point in time. So really having those goals and knowing it doesn't have to be one teacher. Can teachers work with a group of folks and then they go out together and understand how important it is for the community to be a part of the teaching and learning process. So next slide. SACPI's Standard 7, Professional Development and Pre-Service Training for Administrators and Teachers. What does equity look like? Cultural competence, being able to work with communities that may look different, that sound different than your own personal community, right? So we know that there's this diversity gap among administrators, teachers, and students. So we have to make sure that the candidates that we are producing, really, we want to increase the diversity of those candidates, but we also want to make sure that those candidates are culturally competent. So wherever they find themselves, they can see the genius of their students. They can see the potential and power of their students, and they're comfortable working with students from very diverse backgrounds. So that becomes really important. Then also promoting candidates' views of parents as partners in this work and building their communication and conflict management skills. We cannot run away from conflict in education. Conflict is not necessarily a bad thing, it's how it's managed that determines whether it is productive and generative or stagnating. And so we have one educator, one principal who said, I used to have stomach issues over the school improvement plan in my former school. You know, education has become very anxiety, you know, producing for educators, for principals, for teachers. They're like, how am I supposed to meet? How am I to be accountable to all of these various groups for the outcomes of all of these students by myself? And we have to let them know that you cannot do it by yourself. She said, I can't do it alone. This is what an experienced principals sort of came into this understanding. I can't do it alone, but with 40 parents, if I can assemble a group of folk, then we get so much accomplished and we have fun doing it. Collaboration becomes almost essential to effectiveness because the lone, you know, leader who can do it all is just not a a very effective or really valid way of thinking about leadership in today's 21st century schools. So we have to move beyond that model of leadership and make sure that we are building the capacity of our teachers and our administrators to be collaborative. Let's go to the next slide, and I believe the next poll. So you guys have shared, and we're getting really close to a break, so thank you very much, but you guys have shared a little bit before about your familiarity. So we have some more poll questions for you. This time we have 3. The first one is, do you believe that you are providing your candidates with the skills and knowledge they need to implement those equitable standard-based partnership practices? Are you building their capacity to work on this with an equity lens? Okay, that's the first question. And you can be honest, we have yes, we have no, somewhat. The second question, and right now, you know, we only have one person, we have a somewhat. So let's get to responding to the poll. The second question is, for which standard do you think the equity strategies are most challenging? You know, is it the welcoming? Creating a welcoming environment? Is it supporting student success? We have one person who has responded. It's great. And then if we move to the third question, move down to the third question in the poll. The third question is, for which standard do you think the equity strategies are least challenging to achieve? And not surprisingly, people are looking at welcoming, welcoming all families. That's right. Creating that space, because that's something that teachers have direct control over oftentimes, definitely in terms of for their classroom, but principals also. So if you are in an administrator education programs, definitely. So if we go to the first question, people are at the somewhat, you know, somewhat. About 82% are saying that they're providing their candidates with that skill. So I would love to hear from some people around that. We're definitely going to come back to that, Darcy. For which standard do you think the equity strategies are most challenging? Sharing power. That is not surprising. And some people talk about communicating effectively, one. Supporting student success, a couple of people. But overwhelmingly, the sharing power had the highest number of votes. And also collaborating with the community. So we can talk a little bit about that. And then for which standard do you think the equity strategies are least challenging? Clearly welcoming all families. You know, people, I think we know how to help our candidates be engaging directly with their students and their students' families. So let's talk a little bit about this. Folks who said yes, there was one person who said yes, and then one person who said no. And those are always really interesting to me because these are very sort of definite responses. The person who said yes, is there any way that they can unmute, Darcy, and sort of share what they're doing to provide their candidates with the skills and knowledge?
And so while we're waiting for that person to unmute, whoever said yes to question 1, Mavis, I also don't want to forget that Roseanne Fulton said that she had a story that she wanted to share. So maybe after we talk about the poll questions, I just want Roseanne to know I haven't forgotten about you. I wrote you down.
Hi, this is Deb Mortensen from Colorado College. I'm the one who said yes. And about 5 years ago, we revamped our entire teacher preparation curriculum, and every course, every class is focused on culturally responsive pedagogy. It's embedded in all the coursework. And so I think that transition from the very beginning, that's our lens. We believe education is like our job as education preparation faculty is to education is social justice, education is equity. So that CRP lens is just what we do. So all the coursework, diversity and equity in education is one of the classes that's required. Multicultural education is required. We talk about just access to families and viewing every learner as that funds of knowledge, and valuing language and all those lived experiences. So I think we are doing a good job. That's one thing I think we have real strength of our program. So
that's excellent. Thank you so much for sharing it. I don't want to, take up too much time, but you said that you all came together to revamp it. Can you tell us a little bit about what the impetus to that was? Was it a new leadership, or how did you decide it was time?
It's interesting because as a program, we had been thinking and we realized we had to do this, but honestly, we did have our chair of our department who had been in the department for like 40 years, super resistant. So we just kind of hung back for a couple years, kind of doing this planning until she retired. And that sounds terrible to say, but we just knew we were going to be fighting tooth and nail. And as soon as she did retire, we were ready to go. We had done the research and the work, and we had 2 new faculty members whose passion and absolute critically believed that this is what we had to do. So yeah, it was a pretty awesome process. We did a lot of self-reflection of our own personal work as faculty. We do book clubs and kind of talk about privilege, and we did a book club with working through whiteness. So that's what we did.
Kudos to you guys. That is not easy to sort of do this work collectively. So kudos to you. Darcy, should we allow the participant who has a story to share? Can we go there next, and then maybe?
Yeah, let's do that. Roseanne, are you still with us and willing to share your story?
I am here, and my story fits perfectly, Mavis, with the conversation that you're leading. I love this morning. Thanks a lot for all of your energy and all of the work that you've accomplished. It's amazing. So we have in Colorado, this fall semester, student teaching just looks so different for any number of our candidates because of COVID. And so I feel very grateful. We've gotten good leadership from the Colorado Department of Education and the Colorado Department of Higher Education. And Ginny and Corey are on the call, just at UNC, just really talking carefully about what does student teaching look like when sometimes the learning for the K through 6 students is remote, and sometimes face-to-face, and sometimes back and forth, right? So one of our student teachers just called a couple of weeks ago to talk about the Zoom meetings that the school that she's at decided to do with the families. So because of remote learning, they carved out special time with individual families to do a family interview and to talk about what the family dreams of for their learner and what's working and what isn't working, and really an opportunity to listen, like you talked about, and also to learn. I think many times the school's disposition is to make sure families learn from the school. So we have curriculum nights, and we talk about what math we're doing and that kind of stuff. But this was really an emphasis on learning whatever you can from individual conversations and individual families and their grandpa and grandma of the 3rd grade student. So in this case, it was one of our white teacher candidates in a primarily Hispanic school. And she just was amazed at how much she learned. She just didn't think that she would learn that much. She thought it was just something they had to do. And she said, Roseanne, we really have to have more about how to work with families in our coursework that we get at the center. I lead the Center for Urban Education, which is an arm of the University of Northern Colorado. So I just love, our disposition here is to get each of our teacher candidates to stand on their own 2 feet. And I love it when they have the confidence to call up and tell us how we're supposed to be doing our job, because it's just, as teachers in schools, that's what we need, right? We need people who are confident and competent in their classrooms because the work is so hard. So anyway, thanks for letting me share that. We were sort of lamenting how much student teachers would miss this fall. And in fact, what I've been doing instead over the last few weeks is just thinking carefully about what are student teachers learning now in this environment that they didn't necessarily spend as much time learning in a traditional student teaching context, you know? So thank you for letting me share that.
I love it. That, you know, talking about dreams and teachers learning, and also teachers coming back to the teacher preparation programs and saying, we need more of this. This is exactly that type of sort of generative kind of energy that we want to produce so that we're not stagnating, that we're not stagnant, we're not producing candidates who will be stagnant in the field, that we really are at the forefront of this, right? That we're producing educational leaders, right? Who can go back into their classrooms and everything. This is great. Thank you so much. Maybe one more before break, because I know you guys deserve a break. But the person who said no, well, no, maybe that's not the way we want to end. You know, maybe before the break, we don't necessarily want to end, but I'm interested in this notion of sharing power maybe, and anybody who's made progress on that, because that has been identified as one of the standards that might be most challenging to sort of produce candidates who are prepared for this. Can anybody volunteer to sort of talk about, I mean, the last two comments I think are related to this, but anybody want to directly hit on this notion of sharing power? Why is it difficult, or has anybody been able to make some progress on it? No, nobody want to share before we go for that break. Okay, happy to do that. I don't see anything in the chat either. People aren't necessarily volunteering in the chat either.
No, I think, Mavis, I'll chime in really quick, and then I know we'll go on a break and then finish up quickly after. I think one of the challenges that I see at the Department of Education is that there's legislation in place for school accountability committees to have families that represent the significantly represented populations of students. And when you dig deeper into the law, that's 10%. But so there is legislation requiring, with little to no oversight, that schools have diverse groups of parents on accountability committees. That said, you can't mandate relationships. So just because you have the quote unquote right people in the room doesn't mean that everybody has an equal voice or feels comfortable. So I think that's one of the difficulties that I see in terms of sharing power, because legislation doesn't necessarily help. So it's this weird relationship between, do you mandate that people share power? What does it look like to do it effectively and equitably, etc.?
I think that that point is well taken, and it's going to be a next segue into what we're going to be talking about after the 10-minute break. Like, what can EPPs do? Deborah and Roseanne, I believe, have already talked about some of this, because their candidates, because of the training and also because of some of what they've been experiencing with COVID-19 and all of the trials and tribulations, people are ready to share a little bit. Creating that notion that sharing helps me to do my job better, that I can be more effective this way. And I want to share. Like, I want to share with these families, because I know that we're more effective together than singularly. And so that's what we're going to talk about after the break. Thank you, guys. I hope that you take this 10-minute break, get water, refresh yourselves, take care, make phone calls, do whatever you can. Come back in 10 minutes as we wrap up this conversation. But thank you so far for your participation. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Mavis. So we will start back up at 11:47. Mountain Standard Time, Mavis.
11:45 would be good, or 11.
Okay, 8-minute break.
11:45. Yeah, okay. Thank you, Darcy. Initially said 11:47. That's fine.
It's true.
You know, it's interesting as we were creating the polls and the breaks and everything. I'm like, oh, we could have had, once we come back from the break, it was always like 15-20 minutes, but we're closer to like 12 or 13. So if I speed it up, you'll know why.
And Brett, don't forget to start recording again, unless you already have.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you took control over the slides. Mine were bouncing.
Well, it's because that was when I was like trying to admit people into the room and answer chat. I didn't realize that like it was me.
I think I was doing it.
I think it was both of us competing.
I felt like it was a buck that I was trying to control. I'm like, whoa, pony. So I'm so glad. I think it's much easier with you controlling the slides. Thank you.
Happy to.
Yeah. You guys have a lot of great stuff to pull from in the state as you sort of think about this consortium. This is so exciting.
It's very exciting. And, you know, if I could have hoped for what I wanted people to put in the chat and to share, like, it's, you know, for,
yes,
to help people see why this is important and why we need to keep moving the needle, it's been great.
Right. And it's really amazing this work that people are doing because it's not easy to get everybody on the same page in a program or unit. So it's good work, good stuff, good stuff. We can go to the next slide.
Perfect. Yeah, we can get started.
Okay. Because some people are already going to be aware as we think about preparation. I think this even came up in the poll questions that for some programs, they have not yet started to integrate the national standards for family, school, and community partnerships in their programs. And so the National Association for Family, School, and Community Engagement, NAFSCE, we're gonna stay with the acronym NAFSCE, was able to conduct a survey of educators to just talk about their practice and their experience in their schools. When they talked about family and community engagement specifically and their feelings of preparation for this or whether they find this easy or challenging, 70% of educators said engaging families in the community and improving education for students was challenging or very challenging, right? 70%. And 84% said that they would choose a school with more engaged families over one offering a higher salary. So that really underscores what teachers are experiencing in the field. And just like I believe it was Roseanne, I'm not sure, but I believe it was Roseanne who had a student come back and say, you guys need to do more work on this. We need more preparation for this. This really speaks to the NAFSCE survey. Teachers are feeling as though they need more support in building relationships, in meeting the standards for family engagement, and only 40% of the standards of the states are saying that they address this need that teachers have already identified. So what can we do? Again, this is an exciting time in Colorado. Colorado is one of the 7 lead states that are in this consortium, and their plan is to select EPPs to create and pilot programs that support teachers' capacity for equitable family, school, and community engagement. So this is really an exciting time. I feel. There are these watershed moments in education where we really make significant enough progress where we plant a seed that can then spread and germinate. So if we go to the next slide, even before this exciting moment, we had organizations like the Global Family Research Project, which was the Harvard Family Research Project initially, that really was focusing in on, because we understood that EPPs have to take the lead. So what can these educator preparation programs do? Back when it was the Harvard Family Research Project, they had recommendations for all EPPs. One of them was to first familiarize yourself with the standards. Make sure that the standards in some way, shape, or form are embedded in your teacher or educator preparation programs. That in some way, curricular content that advances the skills, the knowledge, the attitudes that we've been talking about are embedded in your educator preparation curriculum. What are those skills? Well, cross-cultural communication, conflict management, relationship building. We know that there are certain skills required for relationship building. We can begin to think about integrating those as we talk about building relationships within the building at large, with administrators, with colleagues, with community partners, and also, and importantly, with families. What knowledge? They need to know what the research on family, school, community partnerships says. Their practitioner-oriented publications, their research-oriented publications. We've already sort of talked about the reviews out there. There's a body of information and knowledge that is quite digestible, accessible, making sure that we integrate that in some way in our teacher education programs. And also strategies for equitable family, school, and community partnerships. And then lastly, the whole notion of cultural competence, developing a critical anti-deficit lens. What does anti-deficit mean? It means looking at people from a position of their promise and their positive attributes, and not necessarily always looking at them from what they lack. So how do you develop this critical anti-deficit lens and helping teachers understand when it can unconsciously influence various actions? So making sure that the curriculum provides all of our candidates with these skills, this knowledge, these attitudes. There are a lot of resources out there. We don't only have to rely on what has been written. I do have a link to some of the videos that the Office of Family and Community Engagement, Darcy's shop, has created. These are wonderful. These are practitioners speaking with excitement about what is going on in their schools. So these are great videos that can be used as tools in our classrooms to help our candidates begin to think very broadly about what we mean by family, community, and school, family, school, and community partnerships. Bringing in stakeholders. How often do we have community-based partners? How often do we have families coming in as guest speakers and as co-teachers of some of our classes? This is an opportunity that we can bring in those stakeholders. So this becomes a natural way that we model for students how they can also bring families and communities in as sources of knowledge as they teach their content areas. Providing professional development past their initial degrees and certifications, and then evaluating our program, having feedback from our candidates to say, do you feel well prepared? Just like Roseanne was saying earlier, when the student is saying, yes, we need more of this, it's great in an evaluative exchange to say, what kinds of skills or dispositions do you think that we can hone in on now that you have graduated? So if we go to the next slide, there are already, let's talk a little bit about what you're currently doing. This is a very quick poll because we have maybe 5 minutes before we finish. So if you can bring up the questions, 2 of them, would your candidates value a greater emphasis? We've already heard from some people. And then how do you currently integrate content on family school community partnerships in your EPPs? Is it a single class? Is it in several classes? Are you focusing on it during the internship? Or is it all of the above? So if we can hear from you as you give us feedback on that, I think this is really important as the consortium begins to sort of think about what's feasible, what's best practice. This has been an ongoing debate. I am very excited to hear that at least 2 of the institutions that are present today or represented today have a single course just on family engagement. Like, I don't think Maryland is quite there yet. So it looks like people are saying that their candidates will value it. That's the first step. I think knowing that the candidates see this as important and helping them see this as important is excellent. And then it looks like for the majority of people, it looks like all of the above. So it's not an either or. And as we think about this and how we design our programs, we should move beyond the either or. Much like we've done with, I think, culturally responsive instruction, that we might have a single class for it, but that single class is not enough. This should be a thread that runs through our reading instruction courses, that run through all of our methods courses, our internship, our cultural diversity courses. We have to be able to bring this notion of family and community in there as best practice. So that's great. I think that that is perfect guidance as we move forward. Then again, I am very excited about what's going on in Colorado. If we can go to the next slide, because there are resources that you can draw on, especially as you begin to think about planning, developing programs, taking this back to your institutions. There's the guide, this assessment rubric that has, again, is part of the P12 framework that has been developed by the Office of Family, Schools and Community Partnerships. And with this assessment tool, if you can go to the next slide, you can see that the elements of effective partnerships, they're bringing into this rubric. And this is just, one snapshot to give you a notion of what is inside of this particular document and tool, but it's very useful. So it is focused on creating those inclusive, welcoming cultures, building trusting relationships, designing capacity building opportunities, and dedicating necessary resources. So individual teacher candidates can use this as a tool to evaluate themselves. Schools can use this as an evaluative tool. Even as EPPs are thinking about, well, what is the curricular content that we want to embed in our various courses? They can draw upon this particular rubric to begin to design and evaluate those. So it is no need to start from scratch. You have a lot of colleagues who are already doing amazing work. You have folks at the policy, the state, as well as hopefully the district levels that are supporting this work. And then you have this amazing consortium that's about to start. So I encourage people to learn more about it, to perhaps volunteer to be a part of it. And that is about all I have to share. I want to thank you guys so much. We have a couple of minutes if there are any questions, any comments. Again, I have enjoyed this time being with you. I really enjoyed the exchange, and you have my email address. So if you want to continue this conversation, if you want a thought partner in this conversation, please feel free to contact me. Darcy Hutchins, again, a great friend of this issue across the nation. She's right there in Colorado to help. I really want to thank Brittany and Kristine for just you know, helping us out, being here early this morning. You guys have been amazing to work with. And just thank you so much. But we have the chat box there. So if there are any last minute questions or comments, anybody who wants to share what their thoughts are about the future of this particular topic in Colorado, I think this would be a great opportunity to share that and sort of send us off on a positive note.
Britt, do you want to send people off on the note of joining us for the focus group on Friday? Since that really goes to what Mavis was just talking about in the future, where we are headed.
Yeah, that would be perfect. If anyone is interested, I dropped in the chat earlier the session information and registration, pre-registration links. But if you would like to talk about what you think a vision for incorporating FSCP into preparation more, we'd really love to talk with you about that on Friday during our focus groups. We have at 10 o'clock on Friday. I'll drop that link into the chat one more time. And then thank you again so much for participating. We will get you the PowerPoint slides and the recording here shortly. And just really appreciate all the interest and participation.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone. Looking forward to working with you more.
Looking forward to it. Thank you, guys. Have a great day and a great week. I'll be tuning in.
That'd be great. Thank you, Mavis.
Bye.
Thank you all.